Springtime on Beecher's Lake is a time when the fish start feeding well, and weights on this lake can be caught up to 150 to 200 pounds when the weather starts to warm up. You're looking to fish with pellets mainly on this lake. Casters don't seem to work as well as what pellets do. Fishing a banded 6mm pellet and pinging pellets out long can be a great way to fish on this lake to catch a big weight. Sometimes in the springtime the fish will also want to come up shallow, so it's worth setting up a shallow rig, either a jigger rig or a fixed rig to fish shallow with the 6mm or 4mm pellets. Will also catch the carp and F1s. This lake, when the springtime comes, the carp and F1s want to come into the margins, and some pegs you can find quite shallow water, as shallow as sort of 18 inch or even a foot deep close to the bank. And here ground bait and maggots works extremely well for catching a big weight. Fishing with quite a big hook, a size 14 or a 12, with bunches of maggots on the hook to avoid the silverfish and catch the carp and F1s. Corn is also a good bait on this lake as well, and loose feeding corn out of the hand on a short pole can also be quite good, fishing round about 4 to 5 metres out from the bank. And loose feeding corn by hand can catch a lot of fish. So that's 3 methods on this lake that work very well. There's also quite a big bowl on this lake where you've got quite a lot of water in front of you. And here on this lake, a waggler cast out to the middle of the lake can also catch the carp shallow. Feeding 8mm or even 6mm pellets can be good on the bigger part of the lake. Where the narrow parts of the lake are, it's difficult to fish with a waggler, so these narrow parts of the lake are almost confined to pole fishing. You're fishing the pole on these narrower parts of the lake. Springtime on Bennie's Lake, you're in for a real treat. This lake is full of F1s. The main method to catch a big weight on Bennie's is fishing shallow, fishing in the upper layers of the water. There's 2 rigs to use. There's either a fixed rig with a shallow, small float, small dibber type float, or an inline jigger type rig. The inline jigger type rig has really took off on this lake because you're keeping the line tight all the time, and a lot of the F1s hook themselves. There's 2 baits to use with this. Casters can be quite good in the springtime, and also 4mm pellets. So that's one method that's going to catch a big weight on this lake. The other method that's important, sometimes the fish aren't up shallow and it's difficult to fish out long on this lake because it's quite deep. So fishing maybe a kitten 1 straight in front of you, fishing on the bottom, is another way that you could catch quite a big weight. Now this line is difficult to feed. If you feed all the time, the fish will want to come up. So you've got to work out how to feed this line. Maybe potting pellets an amount at a time to try and keep the fish on the bottom, or using slightly heavier baits like corn also can work on this lake. So that's 2 of your main methods. There's also quite a few carp now in this lake, and they are a good quality size fish. They're caught often in the 50s, and fishing close to the bank with corn can be very good for catching these carp, and more selective than fishing with pellets. So that's 3 methods that can work very well in the springtime on Bennie's. It's springtime and you've drawn on Laurels Lake. Laurels Lake will be where big weights are caught. This lake does fish really well at this time of the year. To catch fish, you've got to look at fishing shallow. If you can reach an island, fishing in the shallow water to the island and maybe pinging pellets or feeding them via a pot is the way to catch big weights. These fish move on to the shallows once it starts to warm up. A lot of the pegs can't reach the island. Pegs 19, pegs 15, 39, peg 30 can all reach the island, but the pegs off the islands in the open water you'll have to fish quite differently. Once it gets to springtime, the fish want to come up in the upper layers, and fishing casters shallow is a great way to catch these fish. For some reason, casters in springtime are the #1 bait. Big weights are caught on casters fishing shallow, so fishing either a banded caster or double caster or double maggot on the hook and loose feeding casters. You don't want a massive amount of bait. 3 to 4 pints of casters is generally enough to fish this line shallow, out between 13 to 14.5 metres. When you're fishing this line and loose feeding casters, it's important to set a deck rig up as well, because you can catch fishing through the water down onto the bottom. And sometimes putting a pot full of worms and fishing worms on the hook on the bottom can be really good in springtime. Fish start to want to feed up and worms work very well at this time of the year. So putting a pot full of worms on the bottom through the casters is a good way to catch fish on the bottom. Both carp and F1s will come to this method. The other place to look is a short line. In the springtime you can start maybe at 4 or 5 metres where you can loose feed pellets, either 4s or 6s, to catch F1s and carp. Fishing a banded pellet on the hook to try to keep away from the silverfish, where the silverfish are great, but to build a big weight you want to catch the carp and F1s. Fishing in the margins, once you get into springtime, fish want to come into the shallow water, and ground bait and maggots is a great way to fish down the edge. You can fish with a bunch of maggots on a reasonable size hook, maybe a 14 or even a size 12, with 4, 5, 6 maggots on the hook is a great way to catch the carp. So you're looking to catch a big weight, so go with that in mind when you're fishing on the Laurels Lake. Springtime on the bonsai is when the fish start to feed very well. The fish are warming up, the conditions are improving, and fish want to eat. The first thing to do when you get to your peg is assess the peg that you've drawn. With the bonsai lake, every single peg is slightly different. Some pegs are only accessible via a feeder. You need to chuck or cast a feeder to the bank side. It's not in the reach of a pole. So a small method feeder is the way to go. Not a big method feeder, just a nice 30-gram feeder that you can plop in at the side of the island. There's 2 baits to use on it. There's either ground bait or there's pellets. Both work very well at certain times. Fishing baits on the hook like maggots, corn, pellets are going to catch you some fish, so just plop in a feeder to the island. The middle part of the swims are a place really that's only for fishing shallow now. Because there's a lot of sediment and the bottom is soft, fishing shallow is a good way to catch in the open water. And casters work very, very well in the springtime, as well as feeding either 4mm pellets or even 6mm if you're catching carp. So that's another method to fish in the open water. The other part of the swim that you need to look at is the margin. The margins on the bonsai can be quite deep. If you can find shallow water, ground bait and maggots works very, very well. But if you're fishing in slightly deeper water, then you're looking at feeding pellets, either micro pellets in a ball and maybe heavy baits like corn and 6mm pellets in the deeper water is a good way to go, because you can pin fish down on the bottom. So that's 3 different ways to fish on the bonsai that'll all work very well in the springtime. Springtime on the local lake, there's lots of methods can work. This is a big lake and there's all sorts of different ways to fish. What I would tend to do is look at what the fish are telling you. Sometimes the carp and F1s will be up shallow and you'll see them moving about shallow. And on these type of days you can catch fishing out into the lake maybe 13-14 metres, either with casters or pellets. Shallow can be a good way to catch the fish. If the fish are not showing, often they're down on the bottom, so a feeder out at distance, either a method feeder or a scoop pellet type feeder, can be good to catch the fish as well. Worms can also work well in the springtime, and if you're feeding casters out long and catching some fish shallow, it's also worth considering that them casters will also be getting to the bottom. And fishing with chopped worm down through the casters onto the bottom is a great way to fish to catch everything. I've had a couple of really big weights of skimmers on this lake mixed in among the carp in springtime. and it's fantastic fishing. Catching skimmers up to £3 is a great way to build a weight. So there's all sorts of fish to look at. Also the carp can suddenly turn up as well in the springtime, and some of these fish run to quite big quality size. The £15 and even up to £17–18 is a possibility that you could hook these sizes of fish. Now these fish will start to come into the margins. Once you get into springtime, the margins are also somewhere where the fish will come and want to feed in the later stages of a match. Often ground bait and maggots works well on this line, and fishing with bunches of maggots on quite a big hook. You can fish a size 14 or even a 12 with a bunch of maggots. Will catch these fish in the margins. So there's lots of things to consider once it gets to springtime. Waggler can also work as well, feeding 8mm pellets. If you can see the fish are moving about up shallow, a waggler can also work very well on this lake. You don't want a massive waggler, a 4 or 5 gram shallow waggler. To catch these fish will be good. Feeding 8mm pellets out at a distance where you can feed them accurately is a great way to fish. So there's all sorts of methods to consider in the springtime. But just look at the fish will tell you where they are. If you can see them up shallow, you'll catch them, I'm sure. So just think about what's happening on the day that you're fishing. Pressure can also make a big difference, air pressure. Sometimes the fish want to be up, sometimes they're on the bottom. So really think about this lake before you set up and start fishing. Springtimes on Willa's Lake is a great time to be on the lake. This lake really does fish well once the water temperatures start to lift. Majority of the pegs are fishing into open water, and fish want to come up shallow. Once the temperatures get up above 10–11 degrees, the fish want to come up into the upper layers. And in springtime, casters are generally the best bait on this lake. Loose feeding casters and fishing either a banded caster on the hook or double maggot or even double caster, fishing in the upper layers as shallow as probably even 6 or 8 inch deep, can catch a lot of F1s. There's not so many carp in this lake, so F1s really are your target species to build a big weight. Also, it's important not to neglect fishing on the bottom. When you're fishing a long pole shallow, maybe between 13 and 14 metres, I would also look to fish on the bottom through the casters. And often feeding a pot of worms from time to time and fishing a worm on the bottom can catch you a lot of fish in the springtime. Fish want to feed up and they're wanting to eat a lot of bait, and worms seem to work very well at this time of the year. Also, the margins can be quite good. Even though the margins are deep, the fish do come into the margins, but often you'll need to catch these fish shallow. When it's 4 foot deep in the margins, it's difficult to catch the fish on the bottom because you get lots and lots of liners. So loose feeding casters and fishing worms up in the upper layers, fishing quite shallow, maybe 2 foot 6 deep, even in 4 foot of water, can catch a lot of F1s shallow down the margins. So casters is usually the #1 bait through the springtime. But pellets can also work as well. Feeding 4mm pellets and fishing shallow can also be quite good because the noise of the pellets hitting the water draws the fish into the swim. You don't need massive amount of bait. The amount of bait for fishing casters, 3 to 4 pints is often enough, or a couple of bags of 4mm for fishing shallow is often the amount of bait that you'd use through a 5 hour or 6 hour match. The strip lake in springtime is really a lake where it's only pole fishing. It's difficult to fish with a feeder because it's a very narrow lake, and using a feeder is probably not the right thing to do when there's anglers on the opposite side of the lake, so you're really limited to fishing with a pole. There's quite a lot of silvers in this lake, and a good starting ploy is to fish maggots out of the hand quite short. When I say short, maybe a kitten 1, a kitten 2 at the most out from the bank, and it's a reasonable depth on that line as well. And fishing with floats, maybe a 0.4 up to 0.6 is the right size of float to fish to catch all sorts of silvers and maybe an odd F1s as well, just with maggots out of the hand. The next method to consider is a pellet line further out from the bank, and fishing round about 11 to 13 metres using pellets, and potting pellets or catapulting pellets with a catapult is a great way to catch the F1s. 4mm pellets are often the best way to fish on this lake. Fishing a banded 4mm on the hook will catch the F1s and odd carp as well. It's not a lake where the feeder is possible to use unless there's no anglers on the opposite side. Sometimes there's just one side of the lake pegged, and then the feeder can work casting across to the platforms on the other side of the lake. So that's 2 or 3 options that you can fish with. There's also the margins to consider. The margins here on the strip lake are quite deep, and I'd probably either fish corn or pellets down the side. Because of the depth that you're fishing in, you want quite a heavy bait that gets to the bottom, and corn and pellets is the right thing to feed on this line. It's too deep really for ground bait, so you're left with corn and pellets as the margin line feed, where you will catch some carp and F1s in the latter stages of the match. This lake is out and out pole, so make sure that you look at what's happening on the lake. Sometimes the fish want to be up shallow, and you can catch also shallow with either casters or pellets shallow on a shallow rig. Maybe fishing as shallow as maybe 12 or even 10-inch deep will catch the F1s and carp when they want to be up in the water. It's all about the conditions when you get to springtime. You have some days where it's nice, warm, and the fish want to be in the upper layers. So this lake can be really good. There's weights in excess of £100 caught regularly on the strip lake. So have a great day.